chains and sawdust. The tunnel smelled like old blood and fresh sawdust, and somewhere above it, muffled through 3 meters of packed stone, 60,000 throats were screaming for something to die. Cole Ray's stood in the dark with a rusted shackle biting into one wrist and a toolkit strapped, absurdly, to the other, and listened to the crowd's noise roll and crash like surf against a shore that never got tired of being battered. Somebody had painted a number on his shoulder in thick red pigment that wasn't paint. Somebody else had told him, 20 minutes ago, in the flat-clipped cadence his species always used for bad news, that in approximately 4 minutes he would walk out into that light and fight for an empire he had never once been asked whether he wanted any part of. He flexed the hand still holding a socket wrench he hadn't been allowed to put down, and thought, with the strange, floating calm of a man who has run out of better options, well, this is new. Somewhere down the tunnel, iron chains rattled as another set of gates rose on schedules that had nothing to do with him, and the light at the tunnel's mouth flared brighter for a moment, throwing long shadows across the packed dirt floor. The air tasted of rust and old sweat and something sharper underneath, the ozone tang of the arena's ancient heating vents cycling up for the day's events, and beneath it all, faint but unmistakable, the smell of fear that clung to every man who had ever stood exactly where he was standing and known, with total certainty, that he had not chosen to be there. A guard shoved him forward half a step, not unkindly, just efficiently, the way a man moves cargo he has no particular opinion about, and Cole let himself be moved, because resisting now would cost him strength he was going to need considerably more urgently in about 4 minutes, and a mechanic's first rule, learned across 2 years of jammed gears and failing cable, had always been the same: spend your effort where it actually changes the outcome, and nowhere else. The man who fixed the cages. 3 days earlier, nobody in the pit of Calvresh would have looked twice at Cole Ray's. That was rather the point. He wore the same gray indenture jumpsuit every arena laborer wore, stained dark at the knees from crawling under portcullis mechanisms that jammed twice a week without fail, and he kept his toolkit closed the way some men kept a sidearm, because a wrench had gotten him out of more trouble down here than any weapon ever had. His knuckles were scarred from pinch-point injuries nobody higher up cared enough to prevent. He talked to the arena's ancient winch systems under his breath the way some men talked to dogs, coaxing gears that hadn't been properly serviced in a generation, and he had a habit of going quiet around anyone in authority that made the overseers assume he was slow, when in fact he simply preferred not to waste words on people who wouldn't listen anyway. He had been a combat engineer once, attached to a Dominion border garrison during a conflict that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the empire that had conscripted his transport crew after their freighter got caught in the crossfire of somebody else's war. He'd kept bridges standing and reactors cool for 6 years of service that was never supposed to be his in the first place, and when the garrison finally fell, along with most of the men he'd served beside, the survivors had been sorted, efficiently and without much ceremony, into categories. Officers went to negotiation. Soldiers went to labor camps. Anyone with a technical trade and no politically useful rank went to wherever technical trades were needed, and Cole's papers, stamped in the brisk, indifferent hand of an intake clerk who'd never once looked him in the eye, read: Combat Engineer, reassign. Arena Maintenance, Calvresh Pit. He'd spent the 2 years since keeping 60,000 seats worth of a killing floor from falling apart, one stubborn gear and one jammed portcullis at a time, and he had never, not once, expected any of that work to end with him standing in the fighter's tunnel with a number painted on his shoulder in something that wasn't paint. Her Imperial Reckoning. Empress Sarath Vantor came down to the maintenance level exactly once in Cole's 2 years of service, and it was not a friendly visit. She was tall the way her whole species was tall, 2.5 meters of dense, plated musculature under armor the deep, oiled black of a raptor's wing, with eyes the color of struck iron that had never, in Cole's estimation, needed to blink first at anything. She moved through the cramped maintenance tunnels like they had been built specifically to inconvenience her, which, given the Empire's general indifference to the comfort of its laborers, they probably had, and she looked at the assembled maintenance crew the way a woman might look at tools left carelessly out of place. The eastern portcullis failed during yesterday's exhibition, she said. It wasn't a question. Her people didn't do questions in casual speech. Not really. Everything came out flat, precise, formal, no contractions, no idiom, like a woman permanently reading from a report even when she was furious. A duel was delayed 11 minutes while the mechanism was cleared. I do not tolerate delay in my arena. Cole stepped forward because it had, technically, been his repair that failed, in the narrow sense that the counterweight cable he'd flagged for replacement 3 requisition cycles running had finally snapped under load, exactly as he'd warned it would. That be my section, Your Grace. Cable's been due for replacement for 2 months. I filed for it in triplicate. Requisition kept getting bumped for the exhibition budget. She looked at him the way you might look at a stain on an otherwise clean floor. You are frail, she said, not unkindly, simply as observation, the way her species always seemed to deliver insults as fact, not opinion. Your species tires lifting its own weight up a stairwell. It does not surprise me that your excuses arrive with the same speed as your repairs. With respect, Your Grace, the excuse arrived faster than the cable did, Cole said. I can't fix requisition delays with a wrench. Something flickered behind the flat iron of her eyes, there and gone, not quite respect, not yet closer to the mild surprise of a woman unused to being answered rather than simply obeyed. She held his gaze a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, then turned without another word and left, and that, as far as either of them was concerned, was the entirety of their relationship. The requisition for the cable was approved within the week. He never found out whether that was her doing or simple coincidence, and he never asked. The Bloodright challenge. The trouble began, as trouble in the Mordain Dominion so often did, with a law nobody had invoked in 3 generations, and everybody had assumed was safely dead. Archon Kesserin Dresk invoked it anyway, standing before the full imperial court with the calm, unhurried confidence of a man who had spent years arranging the pieces on a board nobody else knew they were playing. The Bloodright, he reminded the assembled nobility, in that same flat, formal cadence every Threxari used for matters of consequence, permitted any archon of sufficient standing to challenge the throne's legitimacy through champion combat, should he believe the sovereign's rule had grown weak. He believed, he said, that Empress Sarath's rule had grown weak. He would prove it, he said, in the pit of Calvresh 3 days hence, with champions of each house's choosing. It was, on its surface, an antique formality nobody expected to matter, because the Empress's own champions, a trio of veteran duelists who had defended her throne twice before against lesser challenges, were among the finest fighters the Dominion had produced in a decade. Dresk knew this. Dresk had, in fact, spent the better part of 2 years quietly ensuring it would not matter at all. The Empress's first champion was found dead in his own quarters the morning after the challenge was announced, a slow poison in his evening wine that had been administered. The physicians eventually determined, over a period of weeks rather than days, designed to look like a long illness rather than murder. The second champion's family received, within hours of the news, an offer of relocation and considerable wealth to a rival territory entirely outside the Dominion's reach, an offer that arrived accompanied by evidence, real or fabricated, nobody dared ask too loudly, that made refusing considerably more dangerous than accepting. The third simply vanished the following night, along with 2 of his personal guard, and was never found. By the second morning, Empress Sarath Vantor had no champion at all, an empire's worth of nobility watching to see how she would answer a Bloodright challenge she was, by every practical measure, already losing, and a duel scheduled in less than 40 hours that her enemy had spent 2 years quietly ensuring she could not win. The Archon's public word. Cole saw Archon Kesserin Dresk in person exactly once before the Bloodright duel itself, during a ceremonial procession through the lower arena levels that Dresk had insisted upon, over the objections of his own security, specifically so the laborers whose fates his ambitions had just upended could see the man who intended to own them by week's end. Dresk was built like every Threxari noble Cole had ever glimpsed from a distance, tall and densely armored in ceremonial plate, polished to a mirror shine that had clearly never seen actual combat, and there was something in the loose, satisfied set of his shoulders that read, unmistakably, as a man who considered the outcome already settled. He stopped his procession before the assembled maintenance crew, Cole NG them, and addressed them with the same flat, formal cadence every Threxari defaulted to for matters they considered beneath genuine engagement. "The Empress has selected a laborer to defend her throne," Dresk said, to a crowd that shifted uneasily but did not dare respond. "A creature whose species tires lifting cargo it was bred to carry. I do not fault her selection, she had, by my design, no other option remaining. I merely find it fitting. A weak reign, defended by the weakest champion available, ends as weak reigns always do." He let his gaze settle on Cole specifically, cold and assessing. The look of a man confirming an insect was as harmless as he'd assumed. "You need not fear the duel unduly, mechanic. I am told the pain, when it comes, will be brief." It was, Cole thought, listening from the back of the assembled crowd with grease still under his fingernails, exactly the kind of speech a man gave when he believed every variable that mattered was already locked in his favor. He had heard versions of it before, back at Haven Reach, from officers certain a battle was already won before the first shot was fired, and every time, without exception, that certainty had turned out to be the actual weakness in the plan. He said nothing back. There was no version of an answer that would matter yet, and a mechanic's instinct, honed over 2 years of choosing exactly when to spend effort, told him this was not the moment to spend any of it on words. Dragged into the sand. The overseers came for Cole in the middle of a repair, hauling a jammed tension spool free of the northern gate mechanism with grease to his elbows and a headache building behind one eye, and told him, with the brisk indifference of men following an order they didn't fully understand themselves, that his indenture papers had been flagged for immediate reclassification. "Combat engineer," the senior overseer read aloud off a data slate as though confirming it to himself. "Prior military service, 6 years, border garrison at Haven Reach, trained in close quarters defense as standard garrison protocol." He looked up at Cole with an expression that suggested he found the whole situation as absurd as Cole did. "Congratulations. You are, as of this morning, the only combat-qualified male in this facility whom Archon Dresk's people have not managed to bribe, poison, or disappear. The Empress requires a champion. You will be it." Cole set the tension spool down very carefully because his hands wanted to do something considerably less careful with it. "I fix gates," he said. "I haven't held a weapon since Haven Reach fell. That was 6 years ago." "Then it will be an educational 2 days," the overseer said, not unkindly, in the flat tone of a man who found the whole arrangement as regrettable as Cole did, and had no more power to change it than Cole had to refuse it. "The alternative, if you decline, is that the Empress forfeits by default. The Dominion falls to Archon Dresk's faction within the week, and every laborer in this facility, including you, becomes property of a man whose treatment of indentured workers is, by all accounts, considerably worse than hers. There is no version of this where you simply return to the gate mechanisms and wait it out." There was, Cole understood, listening to the crowd noise already building somewhere far above him, no good version of the next 2 days at all. There was only the version where he tried, and the version where he didn't, and only one of those left him with a chance of walking away from any of it himself, or the 800 other laborers whose fates had just, without anyone asking them either, been quietly tied to his. "Fine," he said. "Get me a weapon I actually know how to use, and somebody find me the full schematics for this arena. If I'm doing this, I want to know every gear, chain, and portcullis in the building better than the man building the odds against me does." 800 names. Word of what Cole had agreed to spread through the labor quarters faster than any official announcement ever managed. The way news always traveled fastest among people with the least power to change it. And by that first evening, he could not walk the length of a maintenance corridor without at least one indentured worker finding some excuse to be nearby. They did not cheer him, not yet. There was nothing to cheer for yet, only a man who had agreed, under duress that looked very little like agreement, to bet all their futures on a fight he had no formal training for. But an older woman who ran the arena's kitchens left a portion of actual meat on his tray that night instead of the thin gruel laborers were usually rationed, without comment, without meeting his eyes, the way people offer small kindnesses they don't want thanked for. A younger man who serviced the arena's lighting rigs quietly rerouted extra power to Cole's quarters, so he'd have proper light to study the schematics he'd request. Ed, a minor infraction that could have cost the man his own rations if discovered. Nobody said it aloud, because saying it aloud would have made the weight of it unbearable for everyone involved. But Cole understood, lying awake that first night with his cracked rib aching in time with his pulse, that he was no longer only fighting for himself, or even only for the empress whose throne hung on the outcome. He was fighting for a kitchen worker whose only power in this arrangement was an extra portion of meat she couldn't officially spare, and a lighting technician risking his own rations for better lamplight, and roughly 800 other people whose names he mostly didn't know, all of whom had, without ever being consulted, ended up with everything they had riding on whether a mechanic could learn to survive long enough in the sand to matter. It was not a weight he'd asked for. It was, he decided, turning the thought over in the dark until exhaustion finally took him, a weight he intended to carry anyway, because the alternative was setting it down on 800 people who had never once had the option to refuse it themselves. First blood, first lesson. The first trial came the following morning, not the blood-right duel itself, but a preliminary bout the Dominion's ancient rules demanded, a proof of viability, staged before the full court, to confirm the Empress's champion was at minimum capable of standing in the sand. Dresk's people sent a mid-tier duelist to test him, a wiry, quick Threxari half a head shorter than most of his kind, but faster than anything Cole had ever fought, and the bout lasted less than 90 seconds before Cole was on his back in the sand with a cracked rib and a mouth full of blood. The strike itself had come from an angle he hadn't expected, a low sweeping blow aimed to catch him mid-step, and the impact folded him sideways with a sound like a green branch snapping, white light bursting across his vision as his lungs seized around the sudden, sharp wrongness where a rib had given way. He tasted copper before he registered the pain fully, some part of his brain flatly cataloging damage the way he'd catalog a failing gear assembly, rib, cracked, not through, still ambulatory, while the rest of him fought simply to draw a full breath without his whole chest screaming in protest. He got up anyway. That, more than any skill with the practiced blade they'd shoved into his hands that morning, was apparently the only requirement that actually mattered, not winning this early, but proving he would keep standing. He got up with his ribs grinding audibly enough that the front rows heard it, a sound 60,000 people would later swear they remembered clearly, and the duelist, visibly surprised by the sound of a man rising who had every biological reason to stay down, hesitated a full half-second before pressing the advantage. And that half-second, Cole thought later, lying on a medical cot with his ribs strapped tight enough to make breathing an active decision, was the first thing he'd actually won. You should not have risen. the duelist told him afterward, in the clipped, formal tone every Threxari seemed to default to for anything approaching an honest observation. The strike was sufficient to end a contest of this nature by any reasonable standard. Wasn't finished standing, Cole said, around the copper taste still coating his tongue. Bad habit. Comes from 6 years of fixing things nobody else wanted to touch because everyone assumed they were already too broken to bother with. The duelist studied him for a long moment with an expression Cole was learning to read as the particular Threxari blend of contempt and confusion that came from watching a frail species do something their biology apparently hadn't accounted for, and said nothing further, and left. And Cole lay on the cot afterward doing the math on how many more days like this his body could actually absorb before the answer became none at all. Sweat in the iron heat. The second trial was staged in the arena's inner ring, where ancient heating vents, installed centuries ago for ceremonial fire displays nobody remembered the original purpose of, kept the sand baking at a temperature that made the Threxari duelists visibly sluggish within the first 10 minutes. Their dense plated hides trapping heat their bodies had never evolved an efficient way to shed. Cole noticed it before his opponent did. The way the big Threxari's movement started slowing almost imperceptibly as the bout wore past the 10-minute mark, breath coming heavier, strikes losing the crisp precision they'd carried at the start, sweat that his species didn't produce showing instead as a faint, laboring sheen along the exposed plates of his throat where the armor's seams let heat escape unevenly. He remembered dimly a training lecture from Haven Reach about why human infantry held up better than allied species on hot world deployments. No. Strength, not speed. Just the unglamorous biological fact that a human body could shed heat through sweat in a way most armored, insulated species simply couldn't. Evaporative cooling working continuously across skin that never needed to stop and vent the way a closed, plated hide inevitably did. So he ran. Not away. He couldn't have outrun a Threxari in a straight sprint any more than he could have outmuscled one, but around, circling, forcing his opponent to keep pivoting and adjusting in heat that was already working against him, spending Cole's own endurance against an opponent whose armor was quietly cooking him from the inside the longer the bout dragged on. His own shirt clung to him soaked through within minutes, sweat running freely down his back and arms even as the effort cost him real strength. But it was a cost his body could keep paying, over and over, in a way his opponent simply couldn't match once the heat had properly settled into that dense, armored hide. By the 15-minute mark, the duelist was visibly laboring, movements a half-beat slower than they'd started, breath coming in audible, ragged pulls that carried clearly across the hushed ring. And Cole, soaked through with sweat and considerably lighter for it, was still moving at nearly the same pace he'd started with. He didn't win outright. The bout was called a draw when both fighters were, by the arena's rules, too depleted to continue safely, but a draw against a favored duelist, for a man nobody in that stadium had expected to survive the morning, sent a murmur through the crowd that Cole heard clearly even through the ringing in his own ears. He spent that evening vomiting from heat exhaustion in a maintenance closet, alone, because nobody had thought to assign a proper attendant to a champion nobody expected to need one. And he thought, with grim, exhausted clarity, that whatever this was costing him, it was costing his opponents something too, and that trade at least felt fair. The weight of armor not worn. Between the second trial and the third, Cole had exactly one night to solve a problem that had nothing to do with fighting technique, and everything to do with the simple fact that he was, by every measure that mattered, unarmored, while every duelist dress sent against him wore plating that had cost more than most laborers earned in a decade. He did not have access to a forge, or proper materials, or anyone willing to requisition him actual armor on a champion's budget that officially didn't exist yet. What he had was 2 years of intimate familiarity with the arena's own discarded infrastructure, cracked ceremonial shielding pulled from retired gate mechanisms, thick woven cabling meant for load-bearing tension work, and a storeroom full of maintenance gear nobody had inventoried properly since before he'd arrived. He built himself a harness that night, working one-handed by lamplight with his newly splinted arm propped uselessly at his side, layering strips of the retired shielding over key points, sternum, kidneys, the soft joint at the shoulder, and lashing it all together with cable rerouted from a spool meant for portcullis counterweights, tested for load tolerances he happened to already know by heart from 2 years of installing the stuff. It wasn't elegant. It wouldn't have passed inspection on any proper battlefield, but it distributed a strike's force across a wider area than bare skin ever could, and against opponents trained their whole lives to aim for precisely the vulnerable points his harness now covered. That difference alone was worth more than any amount of raw toughness he could have hoped to grow overnight. He wore it under his ceremonial fighting leathers the next morning, invisible to anyone watching from the stands, and when the third trial's opening strike landed exactly where a killing blow should have landed, he felt the impact rattle every bone in his chest and stayed standing anyway, and understood, with the same grim satisfaction he felt every time a jammed gear finally gave way under the right amount of patient pressure, that he had just bought himself considerably more time than his own body alone would ever have managed. The long game of attrition. Dresk's people, growing impatient with a champion who refused to simply lose on schedule, arranged a third trial that was less duel than endurance contest. A running bout across the arena's full grounds, pursued by 2 duelists at once, meant, everyone understood without anyone saying so, to simply exhaust Cole past the point of being able to stand for the actual blood-right duel 2 days later. He ran. He'd learned, over 2 years of hauling gear across every corridor and catwalk in the facility, every shortcut and blind turn the arena's architecture offered, better than any duelist raised to fight in open sand ever bothered to learn it. He led his pursuers on a long, punishing circuit through service corridors never meant for combat. Low ceilings that forced the taller Threxari to duck and slow where he didn't have to, tight turns that favored a smaller frame, narrow catwalks strung above old storage vaults where a misstep meant a fall neither pursuer seemed eager to risk its speed. And by the 20th minute, both his pursuers were breathing hard in a way he wasn't, their heavier bodies paying a metabolic cost for every burst of speed that his simply didn't charge him at the same rate. His own lungs burned by then too, legs screaming with a fatigue that had nothing left to draw on but sheer stubbornness, sweat soaking through his shirt and stinging in the fresh gash along his ribs from the previous day's trial. But he understood, with the same cold clarity that had gotten him through every jammed gear he'd ever fixed under deadline pressure, that the math of this particular contest favored him precisely because he was willing to keep paying a cost his opponent's biology simply couldn't match indefinitely. It wasn't a fight he won by fighting at all. It was a fight he won by refusing to stop moving, hour after hour, long past the point his own legs screamed at him to quit, until his pursuers, exhausted and humiliated in front of a crowd that had gathered to watch what was meant to be an execution, finally called the bout themselves rather than collapse in front of 60,000 witnesses. He collapsed anyway, the moment he was out of sight of the crowd, legs simply refusing to hold him upright a second longer, and lay on the cold stone of a service corridor for the better part of an hour before he found the strength to crawl back to his own quarters. And it was there, staring at the ceiling with every muscle in his body screaming in unison, that he understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief. Exactly what this arena's worth of alien opponents had never once had to learn about themselves, that a human being's greatest weapon had never been strength at all. It was simply, stubbornly, refusing to stop. A murmur among the nobility. The draw in the heated ring did more damage to Archon Dresk's confidence than any of his advisors were willing to say to his face, and Cole heard about the aftermath secondhand, through the same web of laborer gossip that had once carried news of poisoned champions and vanished duelists. The noble houses that had quietly begun aligning themselves with Dresk's faction, confident the blood-right challenge was a formality rather than a genuine contest, started sending careful, non-committal messages back to the Empress's own remaining allies. Nothing so bold as a reversal. Not yet. But the particular hedging language of houses that had bet on a sure thing, and were beginning, for the first time, to wonder if the odds had shifted under them without anyone officially announcing it. One minor house, Cole learned, quietly withdrew a public statement of support for Dresk's claim entirely, citing scheduling conflicts that convinced absolutely nobody, least of all Dresk himself. Dresk responded, according to the same gossip, by doubling down rather than reconsidering, which was precisely the kind of overcorrection Cole had learned to recognize in any system under stress. A man convinced his original plan simply needed more force behind it rather than a fundamental re-examination. The same mistake he'd watched officers make at having reach right up until the moment the whole line collapsed under them. It was, Cole thought, listening to the reports filter down through the maintenance quarters that evening, exactly the kind of overconfidence a mechanic learned to watch for in failing systems. The operator who tightens a bolt harder instead of asking why it keeps loosening in the first place, right up until the thread strips entirely and there's nothing left to tighten at all. He didn't know, not yet, just how far Dresk was willing to overcorrect. He would learn soon enough, buried under 6 meters of drainage channel with a fractured arm and a stranger's warning ringing in his ears. What the cages taught him. The fourth trial nearly ended him, and it was also the one that taught Dresk's people, far too late, that sending a mechanic into an arena he had spent 2 years personally maintaining was a mistake with a very specific, very technical cost. They staged it in the main pit itself. Full crowd, full ceremony. A heavily armored duelist twice Cole's mass sent to finish what the previous trials hadn't. And Cole, exhausted, bruised, running on reserves he wasn't sure he actually had left, did the only thing that had ever reliably worked for him in 2 years of solving problems other people considered unsolvable. He used the room. He knew the northern portcullis's counterweight system intimately, having replaced its cable himself only weeks earlier. And he knew, better than any duelist raised purely to fight, that the release mechanism for the ceremonial cage suspended above the pit's northeast quadrant decorative. Meant to be lowered slowly during victory ceremonies, never intended as a weapon could, with the right timing and the right amount of provoked positioning, be dropped considerably faster than its design specifications technically allowed. He drew his opponent, step by deliberate step, into the northeast quadrant, absorbing 2 solid strikes in the process that left one arm numb from wrist to shoulder, and a gash across his ribs he wouldn't properly feel until the adrenaline wore off. And at the exact moment, his opponent committed to what should have been a finishing blow. Cole rolled clear and slammed his good hand against a maintenance release panel disguised as ceremonial stonework. A panel he had personally installed 8 months earlier during a routine refit, and that only a handful of arena engineers in the entire Dominion knew existed. The ceremonial cage came down in under 2 seconds, iron-shod and considerably heavier than decoration required, catching his opponent across the shoulders hard enough to drive him face-first into the sand, dazed, pinned, and very much no longer capable of finishing anything. The crowd went silent for one full breath, then erupted into a noise Cole had never heard 60,000 throats make before, not for a killing blow, but for a trick nobody had seen coming, executed by a man they'd been told 3 days earlier was no threat at all. What 2 years teaches. Somewhere between the 3rd trial and the 4th, lying awake with too many injuries to count comfortably, Cole found himself thinking less about the fight ahead and more about the 2 years that had led him here without his ever quite noticing the shape they were taking. He had arrived at the pit of Calvresh, a broken soldier from a war that hadn't been his, angry in the quiet, banked way of a man who has stopped expecting anger to change anything. And he had spent those 2 years doing the only thing that had ever made sense to him, fixing what was broken, one gear and one jammed mechanism at a time, without much thought for whether any of it mattered beyond the next repair. He had not thought of himself as brave, or skilled, or anything beyond competent at a trade nobody glamorous wanted. He had simply kept the arena's bones from failing, day after day, because failing bones tended to get people killed, and he had never much cared for watching people die over something a wrench could have prevented. He understood now, lying on a cot with a fractured arm and stitches pulling at his ribs, that those 2 years had taught him this building more intimately than any soldier ever learned a battlefield. Not its glory, because there wasn't any, but its actual mechanics, its weaknesses, the places where an ancient structure's original design had been quietly compromised by a century of budget shortcuts and deferred maintenance. Dresk's people had spent 2 years planning to break a champion. They had never once considered that the man they'd be facing had spent 2 years learning to fix the exact building they intended to break him in, and that the difference between those two kinds of knowledge might turn out to matter more than any amount of raw fighting skill either side brought to the sand. He did not feel lying there like a hero. Heroes, in his experience, got to choose their fights. He had simply refused, for 4 increasingly brutal days, to be the outcome everyone assumed was already decided. And if that refusal ended up mattering to 800 people who'd never asked for any of this either, then the 2 years of grease and jammed gears and unglamorous repair work would turn out, against every odd he could calculate, to have been worth something considerably larger than he'd ever expected them to add up to. Everything breaks eventually. He paid for it that night, and the payment was not metaphorical. The arm that had absorbed those 2 strikes swelled purple-black by evening, throbbing with a deep, grinding ache that made even holding a cup of water an exercise in gritted teeth. And the arena physician, a brisk, no-nonsense Threxari who'd clearly seen every possible way a body could fail under this kind of strain, informed him flatly that 2 bones in his forearm were fractured, and that the gash along his ribs had gone deep enough to require actual suturing, rather than the field patches he'd been managing it with. "You cannot fight tomorrow in this condition," she said, setting the splint with brisk, efficient movements that hurt considerably more than her tone suggested she cared. "Any reasonable physician would recommend withdrawal." "Not really an option," Cole said, through his teeth, watching her work. "Withdrawal's not on the table when 800 people's futures are riding on whether I show up tomorrow. I'll fight splinted if I have to." "You will fight with one functional arm," she said, "against an opponent who possesses 2 and considerably more mass behind each of them. I have treated Hrexari duelists my entire career. I have never once treated a species that appears to negotiate with its own injuries rather than simply respecting them." "Not negotiating," Cole said, "just prioritizing. Arms broken either way tomorrow whether I fight or not, given how it's already sitting. Might as well get some use out of it first." She studied him for a long moment, the same flat, calculating expression he'd started to recognize across every Threxari he'd met in this arena, and said, with something that might, in a longer conversation, have qualified as reluctant approval, "Your species appears to treat catastrophic injury as an inconvenience rather than a stopping point. I do not fully understand the biology that permits this. I am beginning to suspect it is not biology at all." "It's mostly stubbornness," Cole admitted. "Turns out that scales pretty well, long as you're willing to pay for it after." She finished the splint in silence after that, tighter and more carefully braced than arena medicine strictly required, and before she left, she set a small vial of pain suppressant on the table beside his cot, more than his ration technically allowed. "Do not tell the overseers I provided this," she said, already turning to go. "I would prefer not to explain why." He did not sleep well that night. The the fractured arm throbbing in time with his pulse every time he shifted position, the stitches along his ribs pulling tight with every breath, and he lay awake doing the same grim arithmetic he'd been doing since the overseers first pulled him off a jammed tension spool 3 days earlier. How much of himself he had left to spend, and whether it would be enough tomorrow to cover the cost of what the Empress and 800 laborers were both, without ever having asked him. Counting on him to pay. A name before the blade. Cole had not known Threll Overend's name before the fourth trial, only his reputation, a veteran duelist with more sanctioned kills than any three of Dresk's other champions combined, a man the crowd had cheered for 2 decades without once, as far as Cole could tell, learning anything about him beyond his record. He learned more of it, unexpectedly, in the hour after the ceremonial cage came down across Threll's shoulders and pinned him, dazed and humiliated, into the sand. The arena physician who treated them both that evening, brisk and efficient and apparently unbothered by treating 2 men who'd been trying to kill each other hours earlier, mentioned in passing, while resetting Cole's fractured arm, that Threll Overend had fought his first sanctioned duel at an age Cole's own species would have called a child, sold into the arena circuit by a household that had needed the debt his contract paid off considerably more than it had needed him. He has fought here 22 years, the physician said, not unkindly, simply stating fact the way her whole species seemed to default to. He has never, in that time, lost a duel he was permitted to finish. You are, as far as arena records show, the first opponent to end a bout against him without a killing blow at all. Cole thought about that, lying on the cot with his arm being set, and thought about the man he'd caught under an iron cage 2 days earlier, and understood, with the particular clarity exhaustion sometimes granted, that he had not simply beaten a duelist. He had, without meaning to, handed a man who had spent 22 years being nothing but a weapon the first proof in his entire adult life that being beaten did not have to mean being destroyed. It explained, later, why Threll had come to him in the maintenance corridor instead of simply nursing his own wounded pride in silence. It explained the blade offered flat across open palms, a gesture that cost a man like that considerably more than any outsider watching from the stands could ever fully understand. The champion's silent bow. The turning point came not from Cole at all, but from the duelist he'd caught under the ceremonial cage 2 days earlier, a veteran fighter named Threll Overend who had, by every measure of his own culture's pride, been humiliated in front of the entire Dominion by a trick rather than a blade. Threll found him in the maintenance corridors the evening before the blood-right duel, moving with the careful, deliberate gait of a man still nursing bruised ribs of his own, and Cole braced instinctively for retaliation, because a humiliated warrior seeking out the man who'd humiliated him rarely meant anything good. Threll did not attack. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, studying Cole with an expression Cole had genuinely never seen on a Threxari face before, and then, without a single word, lowered himself to one knee on the cold stone floor and set his own dueling blade, flat, across both open palms, held out at arm's length, an offering, a gesture Cole didn't yet know the full weight of but understood instantly on some level below language as something that cost this man considerably more than words would have. I did not lose to strength, Threll said finally, still kneeling, still holding the blade out. I lost to a mind that understood this arena better than I understood my own body's limits. Among my people, that is not shame. That is the rarer kind of victory, the kind that does not require the loser's death to prove itself. He paused, and something in his flat, formal voice roughened, just slightly, into something closer to genuine feeling than Cole had heard from any Threxari yet. Archon Dresk's champion tomorrow is not like me. He does not fight for pride. He fights because he has been told your death will end the matter cleanly. I do not believe it will be clean. I believe you should know what you are facing before you face it. Cole took the blade because refusing it, he understood instinctively, would have cost this man something he couldn't afford to lose twice in 1 week, and said, "Appreciate it." What am I facing? Whispers of a second blade. What Threll told him, crouched together in that cold maintenance corridor while the rest of the arena slept, turned the entire duel from a contest into something considerably darker. Archon Dresk's champion for the Bloodright duel was no ordinary duelist. He was a veteran of the Dominion's border wars named Kael'th Vorn, a fighter with a body count that had earned him the honorific the Unbroken among his own people. And Threll's information, gathered, he admitted, from a cousin serving in Dresk's own household guard, suggested the Archon had no intention of allowing the duel's outcome to be left to chance at all. The Bloodright's ancient rules forbade poisoned blades, forbade any weapon beyond the ceremonial dueling swords both champions would carry, and forbade, explicitly, any interference from either side once the duel began. Dresk, Threll said, had arranged for the interference anyway, a small charge, rigged into the sand itself beneath the exact center of the pit, where tradition dictated the duel's opening exchange always took place, designed to detonate the instant both champions closed to melee range, time to look, to 60,000 witnesses, like an unfortunate accident rather than assassination. Kael'th Vorn himself, Threll believed, did not know of the charge. He was simply meant to survive it, armored as he was, while Cole, unarmored beneath his ceremonial fighting leathers, was not. If this is true, Cole said, working through the mechanics of it with the same cold, clinical part of his brain that had spent 2 years diagnosing failing gear systems, then the Archon's cheating twice, once with the champion, once with the charge, which means the actual duel was never the real threat. The real threat's under the sand before either of us swings a blade. I do not know precisely where the charge is buried, Threll admitted. Only that it exists, and that it is time to the duel's opening formalities. That's fine, Cole said, already turning the arena's full schematics over in his memory, the maintenance access points, the sand's depth across the pit floor, the drainage channels he'd personally cleared of debris a dozen times in 2 years. I know that pit better than anyone alive who isn't trying to blow it up. Give me the rest of the night. The Empress's gamble. Cole requested an audience with the Empress that same night, a request that should have been impossible for an indentured laborer to make and was granted, he suspected, only because Sarath Vantor had, by this point, run out of better options of her own. She received him in a private chamber stripped of the ceremony that usually surrounded her, armor set aside, iron eyes tired in a way Cole hadn't seen on her before, and listened, without interrupting once, while he laid out everything Threll had told him. "You are certain of this," she said when he'd finished, flat and precise as ever, though something beneath the formality had gone very still. "Certain as I can be without digging up half the arena floor to check," Cole said. "But it fits. Man doesn't spend 2 years quietly murdering your other champions and then leave the actual duel to chance. He's covering every angle. I'd bet the charge is real." "If I expose this publicly before the duel," Sarath said, thinking it through aloud in the clipped, methodical way Cole had come to recognize as her actual thinking voice, distinct from the cold formality she wore for court. "Dresk will simply claim fabrication, and I will have accused a sitting Archon of assassination with no proof beyond the word of an indentured laborer and a disgraced duelist. It will fracture the court regardless of the truth." "Then don't expose it," Cole said. "Let him think it's still going off exactly as planned. I know where the drainage channels run under that sand. I can find the charge tonight, disable the detonator without pulling the whole thing out, leave it looking untouched FR. Ohm above, and then tomorrow, when he thinks he's got a guaranteed kill switch sitting under both our feet, we fight the duel on its actual merits. He loses the champion fight fair, in front of everyone, and he's got no charge left to fall back on, and no way to explain why he built one in the first place without incriminating himself." Sarath studied him for a long moment, the same flat, calculating study every Threxari seemed to default to, and said, finally, You are proposing to spend the only remaining hours before your own duel crawling through drainage channels disarming an explosive device on a fractured arm rather than resting. Wouldn't be the first bad night's sleep this week, Cole said. Probably won't be the last. She was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression that had, somewhere across the last 4 days, shifted from the flat assessment she'd first given a mechanic complaining about a snapped cable into something considerably harder to name. You could have refused this entirely, she said finally. The overseers gave you no real choice in the matter, but a determined man finds ways to fail quietly, to lose without appearing to try. You have not done that once. Wasn't raised to, Cole said. And there's 800 people down in those laborer quarters whose whole futures are riding on this same bet whether they ask to be or not. Quiet failure doesn't sit right on my end of that math. No, Sareth said, something in her flat iron eyes settling into an expression Cole hadn't quite seen from her before. I do not imagine it would. Counting the gears. He went down into the arena's substructure 2 hours before dawn, alone except for Threll standing watch at the access point. Moving through drainage channels he'd cleared himself a dozen times over 2 years, his splinted arm making the crawl considerably worse than it needed to be, every jolt sending a fresh bolt of pain up to his shoulder that he simply catalogued and set aside. The way he'd learned to catalog and set aside every injury this week had cost him. He found the charge exactly where the sand's depth chart told him a competent saboteur would place it, centered beneath the pit's ceremonial opening mark, wired into a pressure-triggered detonator buried just deep enough to escape a casual inspection, but shallow enough to trigger reliably, the instant two bodies closed to melee distance directly above it. It was, he had to admit, working through the wiring with his one good hand by the dim light of a hooded lantern, competent work. Not brilliant. Competent. The kind of device built by someone who understood explosives well enough to be dangerous and not quite well enough to anticipate a man who understood the ground. It was buried in far better than the man who'd buried it. The mechanism itself was simple in the way effective sabotage usually was. A pressure plate no larger than a dinner platter, connected through a sealed conduit to a power cell and a modest but sufficient charge. Triggered the instant sufficient combined weight settled directly above it for more than a full second. Precisely the amount of time two duelists closing for an opening exchange would naturally spend standing at the ceremonial mark before the first blades crossed. Disturb the sand too visibly, and a morning inspection would notice. Leave the pressure plate itself connected and functional, and there was no way to guarantee it wouldn't simply trigger on schedule regardless of anything he did to the wiring further downstream, since the detonator's own internal logic didn't care what he believed about it, only what voltage actually reached the charge. He didn't pull the charge. Removing it entirely risked disturbing the sand enough for a morning inspection to notice, and there wasn't time before dawn to properly rebury it undetected. Instead, he did the quieter thing, the mechanic's solution rather than the soldier's. He traced the detonator's trigger line back 6 meters through the drainage channel to its power cell, and very carefully, very precisely, severed one wire and rerouted it through a dead loop that would read, to any cursory check, as fully connected and armed, while leaving the actual detonation circuit permanently, silently broken. He checked his work twice, hands shaking now from exhaustion and cold, and the dull, grinding ache of a fractured arm that had been asked to do considerably more than any physician would have permitted, and then he crawled back out the way he'd come, and told Threll, in a voice gone hoarse with fatigue, "It's dead. Whole thing's a dead loop now. He can trigger it 100 times and nothing happens, and there's nothing left above ground to show anybody tampered with it." "And the duel itself," Threll said. "Kael'th Vorn is still very much alive, and very much intending to end you with a blade rather than an explosive." "Yeah," Cole said, looking at the pale gray line of dawn just beginning to show at the edge of the access shaft above them, one problem at a time. Dawn before the reckoning. He did not sleep, not really, in the few hours between crawling out of the drainage channel and the moment the overseers came to prepare him for the duel itself, he lay on his cot instead, arm throbbing in dull, steady waves, listening to the arena slowly wake around him, the distant clank of the great gates being tested, the murmur of early vendors setting up stalls that would, within hours, be selling food and trinkets to a crowd screaming for his death or his survival in roughly equal measure, the particular hush that settled over the laborer quarters whenever everyone in it understood, without needing to say so, that today mattered more than any other day had. Threll came for him an hour before the appointed time, moving with the same careful, deliberate gait he'd carried since the ceremonial cage had come down on his own shoulders days earlier, and helped him into the ceremonial fighting leathers layered over the makeshift harness Cole had built 2 nights before, adjusting straps with quiet, practiced efficiency that suggested this was not the first time he'd armored a man who might not walk back out. "You are afraid," Threll observed, not unkindly, simply as fact, the way his whole species observed things. "Course I am," Cole said. "Man who tells you he isn't afraid walking out to face the unbroken is either lying or hasn't been paying attention. Doesn't mean I'm not going out there anyway." "Among my people," Threll said, tightening the final strap across Cole's shoulder with careful precision, "we are taught that fear faced without complaint is worth more than courage that never had to feel it at all. I did not believe that truly, until I watched you rise from the sand 4 separate times this week." He paused at the tunnel's edge, where the light beyond had already begun to flare bright with the gathering crowd's restless noise. "Caleth Vorn believes the outcome already decided. That belief will cost him something today. I have learned this week exactly how much." Cole flexed his good hand once, felt the ceremonial blade's grip settle familiar against his palm, and stepped toward the light, carrying with him 2 years of jammed gears, 4 days of accumulated injury, and the quiet, unglamorous certainty of a man who had spent his whole working life proving that broken things could still, with enough patience and the right kind of stubbornness, be made to work exactly when it mattered most. 3 seconds in the sand. The blood-right duel began at midday, under a sun that turned the arena's pale sand nearly white, 60,000 voices gone suddenly, uncannily silent as the 2 champions were led out to the pit's ceremonial center. Caleth Vorn towering, armored, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed, correctly as far as he knew, that the ground beneath his opponent's feet had already decided the outcome before either blade was drawn. "You fight for a throne already lost," Caleth said, his voice carrying flat and formal across the hushed arena, no contractions, no warmth, the words of a man who had said some version of this to a great many opponents before ending them. "I have been told frailty does not survive this ground. I find no reason to doubt it." "Funny thing about this ground," Cole said, loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, his splinted arm held stiff at his side, the ceremonial blade Threll had given him held loose and unthreatening in his good hand. "I've spent 2 years learning every inch of it. You've spent maybe an hour standing on it, trusting somebody else's math." He didn't wait for a response. He stepped forward, directly onto the ceremonial opening mark at the pit's exact center, the mark Dresk's people had wired to guarantee neither champion walked away. And Caleth, expecting the detonation his own side had promised him would end this before real combat even began, hesitated for 1 fraction of 1 second, waiting for a blast that would never come. That hesitation cost him his opening advantage, but not quite his instincts, and his blade still came around fast enough in the confusion to catch Cole's splinted forearm a glancing blow that sent white-hot pain lancing up to his shoulder and nearly buckled his knees on the spot, a sound tearing loose from his throat that he didn't fully register making. He stayed upright through sheer, stubborn refusal, the same refusal that had kept him standing through 4 separate trials this week, and used the half-second Caleth spent registering that his strike hadn't ended anything to close the last of the distance between them. That hesitation was the only opening Cole needed. He'd spent 4 days learning that this fight would never be won by matching a Threxari's strength, and he didn't try. He closed the gap in a single low, driving step, inside the reach of Kael'th's longer blade before the bigger man stalled reflect. Zes could catch up to a threat that wasn't following the script he'd been promised, and drove the flat pommel of his own ceremonial sword. With every ounce of exhausted, adrenaline-soaked force his good arm could generate, directly into the narrow, unarmored gap at the base of Kael'th's throat where his ceremonial gorget met his collar. A gap Cole had studied on every duelist he'd fought or watched fight all week. The one piece of Threxari anatomy no amount of dense plating ever fully covered. Kael'th Vorn went down like a felled tower, choking, stunned, the sheer unexpectedness of a man who was supposed to already be dead closing the distance and ending things before a real exchange had even begun. And the whole confrontation, start to finish, from the moment Cole stepped onto that ceremonial mark to the moment 60,000 people watched the Dominion's most feared duelist collapse into the white sand, had taken very close to 3 seconds. The silence afterward lasted almost as long as the fight had, broken only by Cole's own ragged breathing, and the fresh, white-hot throb radiating up from his newly re-injured arm, which he cradled against his chest without letting his face show quite how much the last exchange had cost him. Because 60,000 people were watching, and a mechanic's instinct, even now, told him that some kinds of damage were better catalogued in private. The empire she kept. The silence broke into chaos the instant Archon Dresk, white with fury and disbelief, surged to his feet in the noble's gallery demanding the duel be replayed, that some trick had been used, that the outcome could not stand. And it was Sereth Vantor, rising from her own seat with the same flat, unhurried calm she brought to every crisis, who ended his protest with a single line delivered loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "You are, of course, welcome to have the ceremonial mark and the sand beneath it inspected, Archon," she said, "by any engineer of your choosing. I understand my champion spent considerable time near that mark last night. I am certain a thorough inspection will find nothing at all out of the ordinary." Dresk's face, for the first time in the entire proceeding, went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing rapid, panicked math about exactly how much his enemy already knew, and he sat back down without another word, because any inspection thorough enough to find nothing would also, inevitably, raise the very questions he could least afford answered in public. Cole, meanwhile, was sitting in the sand where he'd more or less collapsed the moment the adrenaline ran out, cradling his splinted arm and breathing through the fresh agony of having just used it considerably harder than any physician would have advised, while Threll Overin knelt beside him checking, with surprising gentleness for a man his size, whether anything else had broken in the process. The Empress herself came down onto the sand to reach him, a breach of protocol so severe that a full third of the gallery audibly gasped, and stood over him for a long moment with an expression Cole had genuinely never seen her wear before. It settled slowly into something that might, on anyone else's face, have simply been called relief. "You have kept my throne," she said. "Kept your throne, broke my arm worse, and haven't slept properly in 4 days, Cole said, squinting up at her against the glare. "Not sure it's a fair trade, honestly, but I'll take it." "Name what you require," she said, and there was, beneath the flat formality, something that sounded almost like she'd genuinely welcomed the answer. "Full requisition authority on arena maintenance," Cole said, without hesitation. "No more cable replacements bumped for exhibition budgets, and somebody else's turn to nearly die proving a political point. I've put in my week." She looked at him, filthy, bloodied, one arm useless, having ended a duel meant to unseat her in less time than it took most people to draw a full breath, and something in her flat iron eyes shifted into an expression that, on a Threxari, was apparently the closest thing her whole species had to open amusement. "Granted," she said, "though I suspect, Cole Rays, that this will not, in fact, be the last time I require your particular talents." "Yeah," Cole said, letting his head fall back against the warm sand, entirely too exhausted to argue with an empress about the future right now. Get that a lot too. Threll helped him upright a few minutes later, one arm braced under Cole's good shoulder, and together they made their slow, limping way toward the tunnel while 60,000 people found their voices again behind them. A wall of sound that would, Cole suspected, follow him around for considerably longer than he was comfortable with. They will make songs of this, Threll said, with the flat, dry certainty of a man who had spent 22 years watching arena crowds turn every dramatic outcome into legend within the week. 3 seconds, they will call it something absurd, the lightning mechanic, the man who ended the unbroken. Long as the songs come with better requisition budgets, Cole said, they can call me whatever they want. Word reached the labor quarters before Cole himself did, carried by runners too excited to wait for official channels, and by the time he was finally helped into his own bunk that evening, arm freshly reset and properly splinted this time by a physician with actual authority to treat him as more than an afterthought. Half the maintenance crew had gathered in the corridor outside just to see, with their own eyes, that he'd actually survived. Nobody made speeches. The kitchen worker who'd slipped him extra meat set another portion on his tray without a word, and this time, when their eyes met, she allowed herself a small, tired smile before hurrying off, and Cole understood that this, more than any crowd's roar, was the actual measure of what the day had bought. Back to the gates tomorrow, the lighting technician asked him, half joking from the doorway. Day after, Cole said, already half asleep. Northern Portcullis still owes me a proper cable replacement. Empress or no Empress, that thing's not going to fix itself. If you made it this far, drop a comment telling me whether you saw the buried charge coming before Cole found it. And if a man who ends a fight in 3 seconds by knowing the ground better than his enemy earns your like and subscribe, go ahead and hit both, because somewhere out there, another empire is about to bet everything on the wrong underdog.